Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Reformation in our continuing study of the history of civilization. We begin the Reformation really by going much earlier to the life and death of John Wyclif. He has properly received the title of being the morning star of the Reformation. Now, he comes a good 100, almost 150 years before the Reformation, dying in 1384. He studied theology at Oxford and made a distinction in his teaching between temporal rule versus spiritual rule. The church was saying, no, they're the same thing. Whether you have a king or a pope, the pope is in charge, and then he makes kings, and then after that you have bishops and so on. And Wycliffe said, no, they're two different realms. You have an earthly kingdom and a heavenly kingdom, and even though we might live here on earth, we're part of a heavenly kingdom. He taught that no one in a state of mortal sin can serve as a priest. And again, that was, that would almost seem obvious if you have somebody who's sinning, maybe he shouldn't be a minister in some sort of outward major sin. And Wycliffe taught that, but the church was diametrically opposed to that at this point in history. In their eyes, once you're a bishop or a priest or whatever, as long as you say the right thing, it doesn't matter what you do. That was Roman Catholic theology with regards to their leadership. Wycliffe taught that the scriptures are to be our highest authority. He didn't deny every other authority, but he said the scriptures ought to govern us. And that was diametrically opposed to the church, where the church was saying, no, it's a hierarchy. The Pope tells us what to do, and then the cardinals, and then the bishops, and it goes from the top on down, not the scriptures. Wycliffe went so far as to translate the Vulgate, that Latin translation, remember, that had been given to us by Jerome. He translates it into English, the English of his day. Now, the English of his day isn't quite the English that we have today, but they're close enough where if you can hear one, you can sort of make out the other. And he translates the Vulgate into English so that anyone can read it and understand. In fact, he goes on record as saying, I would like everyone to be able to read the scriptures. Now, the printing press hasn't yet been invented. So even though he's translated the Vulgate into English, every copy of every translation has to be hand copied, and that is a long and arduous process. Wycliffe teaches that there are no biblical standards, no foundation for things like the papacy, for monasteries, for prayers for the dead, and the Roman Catholic Church is upholding each one of these based not on the scriptures, but upon their traditions. The followers of John Wycliffe come to be known as Lollards. It seems to have this idea of poor priests. Now, whether they are poor because they don't have much, they have sworn themselves to a life of poverty, or because they're not very good at it, their detractors would probably say the latter. And after his death, and it was a good 20 years after his death, the Roman Catholic Church went in and they dug up his bones, they exhumed his bones, and they burned his bones. As they can't burn him at the stake, he's dead. But they burned his bones and then threw the ashes into the Thames River. And some historians like to point out from there, the ashes flowed out into the sea and thus around the world, as did his gospel. Here's a copy, or at least a small section of his translation of John chapter 17. You get to sort of an idea of how much the English language has changed since his day, and yet it's understandable. These things Jesus spake, and when he had cast his eyes into heaven, he said, Father, the hour cometh, clarify the Son, that thy Son clarifieth thee as thou hast given to him power on each flesh, that is, all things that thou hast given to him, he gave to everlasting life. And so you can hear that. Of course, hearing it sounds like I'm reading word. I am. I'm trying to read the Old English. And the English has changed. And later on, that's going to give the need for a newer, updated translation with newer English. Because English, no language is stagnant, and English is no exception to that. All right, John Wyclif lived then in the 1300s during the days of the Black Plague when such heavy things had come up against Europe. Um, this is also the period which has come to be known since then. They didn't call it this back then, the Babylonian captivity. Now, it has nothing to do with Babylon. What had happened is the Pope had moved out of Rome. Remember, his official title is the Bishop of Rome, but he had left Rome and moved up to France, where the King of France had built him a nice, sumptuous palace at Avignon, and the Pope, went there initially on sort of a vacation, but then he stayed there. And when the next person became Pope, since his entourage who were choosing the Pope were up there in France, they chose a French Pope, and he continued to live in France at Avignon. And so for a year and 5 years and 10 years, all the way up to about 70 years, the papacy had relocated to France. Now that was an issue because remember, his official title is Bishop of Rome, and you've got 70 years worth of popes who never set foot in Rome. And so finally, the folks at Rome say, well, we need to have a pope from our area, from Rome. And so they appoint a pope, and the folks in France don't like that, so they appoint a different pope. So now you've got two popes, and that's going to lead to a time that we call the Great Schism, where you have a pope in France, and you have another one in Rome, and each one is excommunicating the other, and what are we going to do with this? And this goes on for, again, a year and 5 years and 10 years and a bunch of years go by. And finally, they say, well, look, what we ought to do is we'll appoint a third guy as pope, and he'll be pope, and the other two will step down. And so they appoint a third pope, and the other two take a look at who they appointed, and they say, well, we don't think he's that good. We're not going to step down, and now we've got three popes. Well, what are we going to do with three popes? And finally, they say, well, we'll call a council, and one of the popes signs on with this, so he agrees. He agrees to this, and they call a council. The Council of Constance is going to take place, which takes it'll settle on one pope. It'll get rid of all three of them and choose a new pope. But something else is going to happen at that same council. To talk about that, we have to talk a bit about John Huss. He was a priest who lived in Bohemia, what we call the Czech Republic today, and he had been influenced by the teachings of Wyclif. Someone had actually, remember, all books are handwritten, and so someone had handwritten some of his notes and sermons and teachings and brought them to Huss and had given them to him. And he had come to understand through Wyclif that the Bible is supposed to be the basis of our doctrines and beliefs and practices, that the Bible should be our authority, and that only God forgives sins. Now, in saying this, he was speaking out against indulgences, which was a teaching of the Roman Catholic Church during this time. And this puts him on a collision course with the Roman Catholic Church. And as the Council of Constance is called, remember the big issue at the Council of Constance isn't Huss. The big issue is what are we going to do with these three popes and how can we whittle that down to one? But Huss is not invited, he's actually mandated to come to the council because of these teaching issues. And he is given a safe conduct pass. So he will, at least on paper, he'll be allowed to come and present his case, and then he'll be allowed safely to leave and go home again. Well, he gets there, and they put him on trial, and they look to see what he has done, and they excommunicate him, and they condemn him to death. And someone says, well, what about the safe conduct pass? And the answer is, we don't honor safe conduct passes with heretics. And so they burn him at the stake. He is burned alive. The story goes, and it's apocryphal, so the story developed much later. I'm not sure that he really said this, but the story goes that he said as they were burning him at the stake, it is thus that you silence the goose, and you have to get what his name means. You see, John Huss was from a little town and came out of a very poor family, a family that was so poor they didn't have a last name, and so the last name he took was the name of the town. Huss is the word for goose. It was like Goose Town. And so these words, it is thus that you silence the goose, but 100 years hence there will arise a swan whose singing you will not be able to silence. And of course, what this quote looks to, it looks to the coming of one who would be much later. The person we know is Martin Luther. Now, in the interim, Gutenberg invents his printing press. We've talked about this already, but that's going to change everything. And it's going to be the reason that we have a Protestant Reformation. It's going to be the reason we have this whole Reformation. Because when someone writes something, whether it is a Bible or whether it is a treatise, it can be taken and printed, and hundreds and thousands of copies can be made in a very short period without somebody having to handwrite each one. Bibles will now be printed, and that will change everything as well. And so in our time frame, we've talked about Wyclif, we've talked about Huss, we looked at Gutenberg's printing press, but next we come to Martin Luther. Oh, I should mention Constantinople falls, and that puts a spin on everything as well, because suddenly there's an enemy at the door that's coming into Europe. It's the enemy of Islam. Martin Luther, then, was the young man who had received a classical education. His father had actually wanted him to become a lawyer, but in the middle of a lightning storm, he was, I don't know if he was hit or there was a close miss with lightning, and he prayed out, "Lord, if you get me out of here, I'll become a monk," and he survived. And immediately thereafter, he entered, much to the chagrin of his father, he entered a Augustinian monastery as a monk. He went there to get an education and eventually received his doctorate in theology, and from doctorate he went now to teaching. He became a professor in the school at Wittenberg, and he was called upon to go and visit Rome on school or church business. And in visiting Rome, it really opened his eyes because he got to see Rome with all the blinders off. It's a little bit like if you go to Jerusalem today. Jerusalem's a wonderful city, but as you're going through, it's become somewhat commercialized. I think it was Chuck Swindoll who used to say, you go down the Via Dolorosa, and he ought to rename that $5 because they're selling everything for $5 here, there, and maybe the prices have gone up since then. But he visits Rome, and he comments on his spirituality at the time. He says, "Look, if anyone could have gained heaven as a monk, then I would have indeed been among them. But I had come to realize you can't get there by works. I can't be good enough for long enough." And so Martin Luther came to a crisis of faith. Now, his conversion, according to the way he tells the story, was as he came to this passage in Romans, and when you read it in Romans, the Apostle Paul's actually quoting from the Old Testament. He's quoting Habakkuk chapter 2, where it says, "The just shall live by faith." And Luther came to that, and he said, I've been trying to be good. I've been trying to keep all of the rules, and it's just not enough. And he comes to realize, wait a minute, God can accept me not on the basis of how good I can be, because I can't be good enough, but on the basis of my faith. Now, the big issue of the day was indulgences. This was big business that had come to town, where the church was selling forgiveness of sins, where if you can pay enough money, you can shorten your time in purgatory, not just yours, but your loved ones who might be there already. And the little jingle, I'm not sure how it would translate into German, but the little jingle loosely goes, when the coin in the coffer rings, your grandmother's soul out of purgatory springs, little things like that. And this was big business for the church. And on October 31st, 1517, the day that they referred to was All Hallowed Eve. It was the day before All Saints Day. And so the day before that, All Hallowed Eve, or what we call Halloween, Luther goes up to the door of Wittenberg Castle, and he nails a series of postulations, a series of statements, 95 in number, so we know it as the 95 Theses. And this is a set of 95, I'm going to call them bullet points. The bullets weren't there, but they were numbered. And they were statements of faith that he was seeking to propose and even argue and converse and debate. He eventually did enter into a series of debates with a theologian by the name of Eck. And of course, depending on what side you were on, you know how political debates are. You know, you say, well, who won the debate? Depends on which party that you're a part of. The same thing happened here. But in the middle of the debate, Eck said, wait a minute, Luther, you are sounding a lot like John Huss 100 years ago. He was burned at the stake for saying these sorts of things. And Luther says, well, I don't know about that, but I am quoting the scriptures. And if it's in the scriptures, I think we ought to believe it. Luther, after his debates with Eck, he was excommunicated by the church and was issued a papal bull, that is a papal document, outlining his excommunication, saying he was no longer a part of the church. He took that paper and burned it in a bonfire, and subsequently was called now to a meeting, what was called a diet, doesn't have anything to do with what you eat, a diet of Worms in a city called Worms, 1521, and everybody who was anybody was going to be here, and Luther was given a safe conduct pass to come and be heard. Now remember what had happened with John Huss with his safe conduct pass. Well, Luther comes now to the Diet of Worms. And at Worms, the big person who was there was Charles V. He was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand, the ones who had sent Columbus on their way. And they came to, Luther was brought in, and he was not allowed to argue his points. Rather, his books were laid out, and he was asked, do you renounce these? You cannot tell us any further explanation, just simple yes or no. And Luther said, well, can I have a day to think about it? And so they grant him the day, and he comes back the next day. And he says, he gives us a short statement. This is the end of it. He says, I'm bound by the scriptures that I have quoted, and my conscience is bound to the word of God. It is neither safe nor honest to act against one's conscience. Here I stand, God help me. I cannot do otherwise. And his hearing is over that quickly. He is told that he can leave. Indeed, he's got a safe conduct pass. So they say, well, you can actually go home. And now the sentence is passed, and Luther has already been declared to be a heretic. Now he is condemned, and he is going to be put to death. Except that on the way home, well, he was kidnapped. He was kidnapped. He's allowed to return to Wittenberg under his safe conduct, but he is declared an outlaw. And before he can arrive at home, suddenly men, they grab him, put a sack over his head, and they whisk him away to parts unknown. Well, unknown at the time. You see, he's taken to Wartburg Castle because the kidnapping was a friendly kidnapping. It wasn't to hold him for ransom, rather it was to save his life. And so he comes to Wartburg Castle. The castle still stands today. I'm not sure if it looked quite like that back then. And he's going to spend a year in hiding with this friendly kidnapping. And while he is there, he will translate the New Testament into the German of his day. You know how later on we have the King James Version, a very old and established translation of the Greek and Hebrew into English. Well, the Lutheran translation is to the German-speaking people what the King James is to the English-speaking people, and it's going to become the popular translation of his day. As he translates right now, the New Testament, later on the Old Testament will be translated as well. Now, while he is there, civil unrest breaks out, which will eventually fan into a peasants' revolt. It's going to be huge. But this civil unrest breaks out, especially in his hometown of Wittenberg, and he hears about this, and Luther says, I need to go back home. And so he leaves his confinement, and he goes back to Wittenberg. Now, he doesn't hold any official office, but he goes into the pulpit, and he begins to preach. And after about 2 or 3 weeks of preaching, the civil unrest dies down. And it's after this that he takes a wife. Remember, he had been a priest, but he says, wait a minute, the Bible doesn't say anything about how you have to be single. And And so he urges priests, go and take wives. And after all, those who are overseers in the church ought to be married faithful to one woman. Titus says that. The Epistle of Titus, the Epistle of Timothy, chapter 3 says the same thing. And he encourages the nuns to go and take husbands, and a bunch of nuns come to him, and he actually plays as matchmaker to various ones. And he comes to Catherine von Bora and he says, now we need to find a husband for you. And she says, I've already found a husband. And he says, oh, really? Who's that? And she says, well, you are. And so he marries his Katie, as he comes to call her, and they have several children, and it's a very happy marriage. He would often talk in his table talks about his Katie. Now, while that's taking place in Germany, at the same time in Switzerland, there's another reformer independently of Luther, but about the same age, by the name of Ulrich Zwingli. And Zwingli comes to Zurich in Switzerland about just a little over a year after the 95 Thesis has been posted on the door of Wartburg Castle, but well before the Diet of Worms. And Zwingli comes to Zurich and he begins his preaching ministry January 1st, 1519. Remember the Diet of, not the Diet, but the 95 Thesis had been posted October 31st, 1517, so about 14 months earlier. And he begins his preaching ministry, Zwingli does, and he says, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to preach through the Gospel of Matthew, and he starts in Matthew chapter 1, and then goes through chapter 2, and he just preaches through Matthew. In the language of the people, not in Latin, which is not the way things are normally done. And people are hearing the word of God in their own language, and it just changes their life, and it changes their city. And after a while, they're taking the statues and the icons out of the churches, and they're saying we shouldn't have those as a way to worship God. God says don't worship using idols and things like that, so let's not do that. And eventually, in 1529, Zwingli has started a Reformation that has spread to a number of cities in Switzerland, and at the same time, Luther has started a Reformation that was down in Germany, and they say, can we get together and work out any of our differences? They come together at a place called Marburg to see, are we on the same page, or if we're not, can we at least work together? And so these discussions that Zwingli has with Luther are held during this Marburg colloquy. And the sticking point, there were about 15 points they discussed. They agreed on so much. They agreed on the scriptures, and they agreed on how one is saved, salvation by grace through faith. But the sticking point was over the Lord's table. Luther held to what has come to be known as consubstantiation. Now that's different from what the Roman Catholic Church taught. The Roman Catholic Church taught that when you eat the bread and drink the wine, that the bread and the wine actually become the body and blood of Jesus. And Luther said, no, but there is a real presence with the elements at the Lord's table. Somehow Jesus is physically present with the bread and with the wine. And Zwingli said, well, no, I think that it's just a memorial. We meet the Lord spiritually. We pray to him. But we're remembering him. But the bread is bread and the wine is wine. And it's not like Jesus is somehow in it physically. And they met and they talked and they could not agree. And at the end of the discussion, they got up from the table and Zwingli reached out his hand to shake Luther's hand, and Luther would have none of it. I won't shake hands with the spawn of the devil. And what this guaranteed was that now there would be not one Protestant or Reformed denomination, but a number of them, all at odds with one another.